Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to begin this class by telling you a little bit about myself. My name is Sue Coffey. Hopefully, we've already had a chance to meet via my other presentation that talked about the course assignments. And I wanted to take a few minutes to talk to you about what I think makes a good high acuity nurse. I've been a nurse for 28 years. It's hard to believe. I can't imagine a life where I practiced anything else, where I studied anything else. Nursing has been a source of joy for me. It's been difficult for me. It has been an inspiration, and every day has been learning. It is a gift. High acuity nursing is the last thing I ever thought I would do. By nature, I'm someone who is somewhat contemplative. I like to think things through. I would say I'm not the kind of person who by nature likes the performance art aspect of nursing where everything is viewed by people, where I think if I were to have gone through a different kind of nursing program, had different kind of learning experiences, I might have ended up doing community nursing or something else where it's much more sort of cerebral in your head and you come up with a product that you deliver. But here, this is the story of my life. I completed what is similar to your integrated practicum in a high stress specialized surgical unit that focused on hepatobiliary surgery and liver transplants. I loved it. I loved the fast pace of it. I loved the learning opportunities involved in it. I loved feeling as though I was developing skill and capacity day by day. And after a couple of years, felt I was ready for a new experience. I had a good colleague who at the time was interested in high acuity nursing, and I decided to tag along with her for some opportunities to see ICU and ER settings. And I still don't understand how it happened, but I ended up finding myself in a job interview in an emergency department in Toronto, taking that job and beginning the most exciting part of my nursing career. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what I think makes a good high acuity nurse. I asked some colleagues how they would answer that question, what they thought constitutes a good high acuity nurse. And I got lots of different answers: the ability to think quickly, the ability to manage stress effectively, the ability to communicate well in very difficult situations, critical thinking, all those kinds of things. And those answers didn't surprise me, but as I thought about them, I realized that my answer is a little bit different. What I would say is what makes a good high acuity nurse is humility. And the reason I say humility is because of a very remarkable, joyful, exciting, and incredibly painful experience that I had many, many years ago. And I'd like to share it with you. And I'm going to read parts of it because in reflecting upon that time in my life, that moment in time, I've had an opportunity to really think about what mattered to me and how I learned from it. And so here's the story. So I was working in a major emergency department, one of the second busiest in all of Canada. It was the mid-1990s. I love the emergency department because I love the intensity and I love the opportunity to intervene and to help people when they're most in need. For me, that moment of connecting with a person is remarkable. I also like to feel capable and successful in a crisis. All hands on deck. I'm your girl in an emergency. One night I was working in the resuscitation room, and I like the resuscitation room. I like the action. I like the requirement that you would be a good thinker and a good clinician. I felt skilled and competent in the resus room, and not everybody always is. We had no patients at that moment when I arrived and I got report. And I was just doing my checks, checking all of the beds, making sure that everything was set up as should patients arrive and we need to begin to provide care, when we heard a commotion out in the lobby. It was a young teenage girl. She had come into the lobby and started screaming, "My boyfriend's been stabbed, my boyfriend's been stabbed." She was quite hysterical, screaming and sort of moving her arms around, and she literally collapsed onto the ground. She was crying, and several nurses ran over to her. There were two paramedics who were in an ambulance waiting room just beside where she had come in, who came out, heard the commotion, tried to get some details from her about where this had happened, and she relayed that it was a few blocks away. And they jumped in their ambulance to go and try to find the patient. Well, at the same time, this young man's friends had put him in the back of a car, bleeding, becoming incoherent by the moment, and driven him to the ER. So within just a few short minutes, a car pulls up. They open the doors. There was so much blood that when you put your hands on the seats of the car, your hand was covered in blood as it seeped up from the foam in the back seat, car seat. The paramedics pulled up just shortly after the car, so they were able to help to lift this young man out of the back of the car, put him on a stretcher, and bring him into the resuscitation room, and there I was. And I remember looking at this man. He was young, about 15 years old, big and lanky, so not a little guy, blonde hair, wearing some kind of silly gang insignia stuff. But he looked so young. He was pale as can be. He was bleeding externally. He was incredibly tachycardic, heart rate about 166. He had a blood pressure of 60 on palp. He was flailing, pale as can be, with diaphoresis. Lips were blue, flailing and screaming. No IVs, no IVs, no IVs, no needles, no needles, no needles. The team was around the bed, and I remember everybody jumped to action. There was myself. I was the primary nurse in the resuscitation room. There was my colleague who was working with me that day. There were about 4 other nurses. There was the resident. There was a male attendant who was there to help should he need to run and get blood products, other kinds of things. The RT had come. The room was busy, and we were all around trying to assist this man as he was yelling, no needles, no IVs, no needles, and it was frantic, and it felt frantic to the point of violent. And I remember thinking, this is not going to work. At one point, trying to stretch out his arm as he fought me to hold his arm up, and I looked up at the monitor and saw his heart rate at this point was 186. His blood pressure was no longer recording by the electronic monitor, and I knew that we had very little time. And I did a funny thing, even as I think back on it. I remember looking around the room thinking, these may be this young man's last moments, and we are violently trying to help him, and it's not working. And I remember yelling to everyone to step back, get back. And I don't know why, but everyone listened. Maybe they listened because they also knew this was not working. It was pandemonium. I put my mouth to this young man's ear, and I said, "My name is Sue. What's your name?" And I waited, and he sort of jerked and started to yell, "What?" And I think he thought I was going to say something about IVs, something about needles, something about what had to happen. And I repeated myself, "My name is Sue. What's your name?" He looked at me with wide eyes and said, "My name is Chris." I said, "You know what, Chris? We need to talk, and we need to talk fast." I put my hand down where his hand is, and this is the technique, and I'm going to show it to you in class that I've used for 20 some odd years. I put my hand open and near his hand in a way that created an invitation. Should he want to take my hand, it was there. If he chose not to take my hand, it was not there. It was easy and it was available, and he grabbed my hand and he held it tight. I said, "Chris, you're in trouble. I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to tell you all the truth. We know you've been stabbed and you're bleeding out. You've got blood on the outside of you and you're bleeding on the inside too. And we don't know how much bleeding is happening there. The heart monitor tells us that your heart is racing and your blood pressure is very, very low. This is something we call shock. And I know you know that's a pretty bad thing." And he looked at me and nodded. And I said, "And Chris, what I need to do is start an intravenous. If we don't treat your shock, Chris, I'm afraid you're not going to make it. We need to start an intravenous." And as he looked at me, I also said, "And if there is one person in this hospital who is the very best person to help you, it's me. I want you to stretch out your arm and let me start an intravenous." And if I wasn't the best person to do it, I would have got the best person to do it. I was asking this man to do more than he thought he could in a moment when I needed his help and I needed to help him. And it almost felt magical as Chris stretched out his arm without saying anything. and let me start an intravenous. I asked him to stretch out his other arm so the nurse on the other side could take some blood and start a second line. I also began to explain to him what was going to happen. I told him that there were many things that were going to happen in a very short period of time, that as we looked after him, there were some things that might be difficult. There are some things that he may not want, and there were times when he would have choices, but if there was something that I thought he might not have a choice about because the consequence would be so serious, I would let him know. And as I finished, I said, and one thing I want you to know, Chris, is I'm going to be here. I'm going to be here with you throughout it all. He looked at me and he said, can you say that again? And I took a big breath and started to tell him the story again about there were many things and that he was going to have that were going to have to happen in a very short period of time. And he said, no. Can you say to me, you're going to be with me the whole time? Even as I say that now, my heart stops a little bit, thinking about that bridge between Chris and me. So we carried on, and honestly, it was like a ballet. It was perfection. We did everything that we could. We stabilized him, we ran fluids, we got blood products, surgery was called, the surgical resident was there within minutes. I remember he came in with a pair of socks in his pockets. He had bare feet in his shoes, and he had raced out and had his socks tucked into his pocket. And we had x-rays, we had some preliminary diagnostics that told us a little bit of what was going on, and this happened in very short order. Chris had very serious complications from being stabbed. He was going to require a chest tube, and he was going to require immediate surgery. As the surgeon came in, I shared with him that I had told Chris as soon as his mom arrived, I would let her in. And just as I said that, the unit clerk came in to say that his mom was there. The surgeon looked at me as if I was crazy and said, she'll have to wait. I'm going to put in the chest tube. He's got an obvious pneumothorax. And I gently and quietly, but firmly, continued to advocate for Chris that it was important that his mom come in. I had promised him as soon as his mom arrived, I would let her in. And the surgeon continued to prepare, drawing up his xylocaine for freezing to insert the chest tube, shaking his head, making it clear to me that he was unwavering in his decision that the mom would not be allowed in. I didn't know what we were going to do with this standoff. And as this was happening, the surgeon walked in. He was a senior man in his 60s, a staff man at the hospital since I had arrived more than 5 years earlier. He sort of shook his head in a way that I didn't understand, thinking that maybe he was criticizing me, thinking that my priorities were out of whack. There's those nurses again, always worried about the person and not the patient. And as I turned to continue my conversation with the resident, I heard a click of the door. Glancing over, I saw that the surgeon had walked back in with a woman in her mid-40s. It was Chris's mom. The surgeon waved me over, said to me, Sue, this is Chris's mom, and looked at me with eyes that I will remember for the rest of my life and said, I have a 15-year-old daughter at home. I can't imagine what it would be like sitting in that waiting room. Can you help his mom to go and see Chris? I remember looking at his mom and saying, can you hold it together for 30 seconds? I want to take you over. Chris wants to see you more than anything. Can you hold it together? Tell him you're here. Let him know you'll be here through the whole time he's here. And then we'll go back out. She nodded, saying nothing, and came over with me. That was the bravest woman I've ever seen. She held his hand. She kissed him on his cheek. She said, my dear boy. She didn't cry. She said, Chris, you're a strong man. You're strong like your dad. You're strong like your mom. And in a couple of hours, you're going to be strong as you come out of the operating room. I'm going to be here no matter what. And I will see you when you come out. The strength that emanated from her was remarkable. And the impact that it had on Chris was incredibly memorable. I told Chris I'd be back in a minute. I was going to help the resident with the chest tube, but in the meantime, my colleague would take over. And as I walked the mother out, she seemed to be completely in control until the door closed behind us to the resuscitation room. She rested her back against the wall and slid silently to the floor and began sobbing. I remember even at the time sort of lumbering down. It's, these moments that in a movie or on TV would be beautiful, and in real life you're thinking my underpants are showing and my pants are falling down and I'm getting a cramp in my calf as I try to get down there to that woman, but held her in my arms as she sobbed. And then pulled herself together. And together I walked her out to the quiet room, set her up, made sure she had a phone to call somebody to come and be with her, told her that I would let her know everything that is happening and that she could come to the desk at any point to find out more information. But in the meantime, I was going to go back in and work with Chris and the doctor, and that she could trust that we were doing the very best that we could with him. And I went back in. And there was Chris with the chest tube. And my colleague was very competently assisting the surgeon, and I felt good. I felt really as though we had done everything that we could in that moment to stabilize this young man who was very critically ill. And just as I thought that, the door opened and another patient came in. This patient was having a massive MI. My colleague was in the midst of working with Chris, still stabilizing the chest tube and getting that all set up. They were going to have to do some more x-rays to make sure that Chris had a pneumothorax and hemothorax. They were going to have to make sure that the chest tube placement was good. I knew that he was in good hands with the team that was still at the bedside, and I began to work up this new patient having an MI. He had to be sent to angio. I went with him. As I was doing this, I started to feel as though this was a night where I was shining. I felt as capable as any emergency nurse could feel. It was critical. We were doing everything we could, both for Chris, who was a massive trauma and a young 15-year-old boy, and this older man who was having a massive heart attack, and we were employing the best of modern emergency care. I remember wheeling the stretcher back towards the resuscitation room, feeling almost as though my hair was floating behind me. I was a superstar. As I wheeled that stretcher into the resuscitation room, I looked casually over to Chris. And I felt sick. Chris had an NG tube, and Chris had a catheter. Now, those are normal things. Every trauma patient is going to have an NG tube. Every trauma patient is going to have a Foley catheter. But Chris wasn't every trauma patient. Chris was a 15-year-old boy, and I had promised Chris, when there's a choice, I'm going to let you know there's a choice. And when there's not a choice, I'm going to tell you there's not a choice. I don't think, Chris, you're not going to make it without this. And I thought about it for a second. And what I had said was that I'm going to be with you throughout it all. My eyes met his for a second. And in that moment, he turned away. And you know what I felt? I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed knowing that in that moment, with all good intentions, I had lost who I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to hold on to. So what about the Foley catheter? Did a 15-year-old boy need to have a Foley catheter inserted in the ER? Maybe. Maybe we needed to know what was involved, if he had bleeding, if his kidneys were involved. Certainly his bladder wasn't involved from the location of the stab wounds. Maybe we needed to know if he had blood in his stomach. But he was going to the OR in 5 minutes. Could we have waited until he was in the OR? Possibly. Could we have advocated for that? Certainly. Could I have been with him? Yes. Could I have kept my promise? Yes. Did I keep my promise? No. And the look on his face reminded me that I had lost my way. I stabilized my patient, put him, the cardiac patient, put him back on the monitor, made sure that he was hooked up as another physician came to assess him and get some history and continue to determine what next steps would be for him. With a sinking feeling in my heart, I went over to Chris's bedside, determined to do what I needed to do. I put my hand again near his and said, "Chris, I see you've got some new tubes." And he just looked at me. And I said, "I see you've got a tube in your nose and a tube in your bladder." And he continued to look at me. And I remember that feeling in the pit of my stomach when he started to turn away and a tear started to roll out of his eye. And there was nothing more to say except, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Chris, I wasn't here. I'm sorry I didn't keep my promise. I know they've been taking good care of you, and I know these were probably necessary, but I'm sorry I wasn't here because I told you I would be. Just as I said that, they came to take Chris away. They took him to the OR. He had surgery. It was very lengthy surgery. Chris had had very serious damage to both his liver and one of his kidneys. He had a nephrectomy and he had a major liver resection. He was admitted to the hospital for over a week and discharged. I suspect this experience changed him on many levels, both physically and mentally, emotionally. I know this experience changed me. It changed me as an emergency nurse because what I learned was that it was always about humility. It was always about holding on to who you are as a human being. For me, it was always about keeping your promises. Above all else, keeping your promises. Don't make a promise if you can't keep it. Once you've made a promise, it's your word, and you need to keep it, or you need to go back to that patient and renegotiate what's possible. We make mistakes all the time in high acuity nursing. The best that we can do is honor the lives of those patients who are impacted by our growing practice, our learning on the job day by day, by making sure that we don't keep revisiting those mistakes, by making sure that we learn from them and we grow from them and we do better. Each and every day, we do better. Every day I went into practice, every day following that incident with Chris, I brought him and that experience with me. And every day I thanked him for the generosity of allowing me to care for him and allowing me to learn from that moment. I hope for you, as you move into your experiences in high acuity nursing, there are opportunities to learn and grow. I hope that you come to understand who you are and what matters to you, and that you bring that with you as you forge those critical bonds with your patients. I hope over the next 12 weeks, as we explore all kinds of different situations and critical care concepts, that you come to appreciate how there's not always one right answer, but in the face of every situation, the need to be connected to another human being is paramount. And that within the healthcare team, nursing plays a role that no one else plays in that respect. Thank you for an opportunity to share my own experience, and I look forward to hearing back from you about yours.